Tonight we find ourselves standing in Europe during the summer of 1945. The guns have fallen silent, Berlin has fallen, Hitler is dead, and the Third Reich has ceased to exist. Or so everyone believes. History has a habit of ending wars far more neatly than the people who actually lived through them. The reality was considerably messier. Across Europe, millions were displaced, governments collapsed, borders shifted, entire populations were on the move, and amongst them travelled another category of refugee entirely. Men who had no intention whatsoever of facing justice. Most people know the ending. They know about Nuremberg, they know about the trials, they know the names that became synonymous with evil. What is less widely understood is how many of the perpetrators simply disappeared. They didn't vanish, they didn't escape into myth, they just disappeared via paperwork, via bureaucracy, via administration. A system of passports, visas, refugee documents, shipping manifests, and charitable organisations that often ask fewer questions than history would later demand. And that system is the subject of Anima Perduta. The title means lost soul, a fitting description for many of the men who passed through these events. Some had lost everything. Others had forfeited their souls long before the war had ended. Some believed they were beginning new lives. Others understood perfectly well what they were and what they were carrying with them. The war had ended. The machine had not. The story begins in Trieste, a city uniquely suited to uncertainty. For centuries it belonged to everyone and to no one. A port, a frontier, a crossroads. A place where identities could change as quickly as governments. And in May of 1945 it became the perfect place for a man to begin disappearing. Not because anyone was helping him, because the world was too busy rebuilding itself to notice. And from Trieste, the trail leads south to Rome, to a narrow street near Piazza Navona, to a building that still stands today, the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima, a German church in Rome, a place that would become one of the most controversial locations in the history of post-war Europe. Not because of what happened there during the war, but because of what happened afterwards. History often prefers villains who wear uniforms, but the reality is usually less theatrical. Most systems are sustained by clerks, administrators, secretaries, officials, people who stamp forms, who approve applications, move files from one desk to another. One of the recurring themes throughout the Orsus series is that institutions frequently outlive the events that created them. Governments fall, empires collapse, but the paperwork survives. And in many cases, that paperwork determines what happens next. The historical figures featured in this volume are not inventions. Franz Stangl, Gustav Wagner, Odilo Globocnik, Alois Hudal, Krunoslav Draganovic, Adolf Eichmann, Otto Skorzeny, and many, many others. Some of them became infamous, but most of them didn't. Yet together they formed part of a remarkable post-war migration whose consequences would echo for decades. One of the episodes examined in this volume concerns the capture of Odilo Globocnik, the principal architect, perhaps, of Action Reinhard. A British officer who confronted him had almost no evidence. No documents, no photographs, no confession, just a suspicion. So he called out a name. Globochnik! The prisoner barely reacted, but there was a fractional movement of his head. Nothing more, yet it was enough. And in that instant, a man who had spent years constructing false identities briefly remembered who he really was. History often turns on moments far smaller than people imagine. What fascinated me whilst assembling the repository material for this episode was not merely the escape routes. It was the continuity, the persistence, the realization that networks always survive defeat. Relationships survive defeat. The structure survives defeat. People who had worked together before 1945 frequently continued working together afterwards. The names had changed, the uniforms had disappeared, but the machinery remained remarkably familiar. Which brings us to the central question of Anima Perduta. When does a war actually end? Is it when a government surrenders, when a treaty is signed? Is it when the shooting stops? Or does it end only when the people who create it finally disappear? The answer, as ever, is rather more complicated than we might like to think. For the Equispellici, these events represent something more than historical curiosity. They represent another example of a recurring truth. Institutions rarely die. They tend to adapt, to disguise themselves. They learn new languages, they acquire new documents, and occasionally they convince the world that they no longer exist. Thank you for visiting the reading room, and I hope you enjoy Anima Perduta. And remember, sometimes the most important journeys in history are not the ones that appear on maps. They are the journeys that are hidden inside filing cabinets. Good evening.